My parents left me to die in a hospital bed, but I woke up to finish what they started. She's not our real daughter. It should have been a dream, the kind that dissolves when the lights flick on. But it wasn't. I heard those words not in sleep, but while suspended in the liminal hush of a hospital coma, floating somewhere between this world and the next. And even in that void, something in me fractured. My name is Evelyn Hart. I'm 28 years old. I was born in spring, or so I've been told. Raised in a picture-perfect suburb of Boston, with white picket fences and blue shuttered windows. From the outside, we looked like a Hallmark postcard. My parents, Richard and Helen Hart, were both esteemed in their professions. My father a corporate lawyer, my mother a philanthropist of well-curated charities. My younger sister Emily was the golden girl, all sunbeam smiles and accolades. And me, I was the responsible one, the achiever, the old soul, the one who made the honour roll, who got into Stanford, who started her own biotech company by 25. I wore perfection-like armour, but inside it was an unanswered question. A silhouette in family photographs, always half-shadowed. I didn't know I was adopted until I was 12. And even then, it wasn't something they told me, it was something I overheard. A late-night fight between my parents muffled through the heat vents. Something about making up for not being hers. Something about this was never the deal. I remember confronting them the next morning. I was still wearing my pajamas, my hair tousled and clutching a cereal bowl like a shield. "I heard you last night," I said. "I know I'm adopted." My mother looked up from her coffee with that tight, impeccable smile that meant we are not doing this. "Don't be dramatic, Evelyn," she said. And that was that. No denial, no confirmation, just dismissal. From then on, I lived with it the knowledge that I was in this family, but not of it. I told myself it didn't matter. That love was shown through consistency, not biology. But the way my parents treated Emily, the softness in their eyes, the indulgence in their tone reminded me daily that I was other. Still, I tried. God, I tried. Every award, every promotion, every milestone, all in hopes of hearing one sentence. "We are proud of you." It never came. And then came the accident. It was late. I'd stayed at the office tweaking a code set for our new medical diagnostics AI. It had started to rain, that cold, whispering Boston rain that soaks your bones. My business partner Sloane had told me to call a ride. I didn't. My apartment was only 15 minutes away. What could happen in 15 minutes? A drunk driver, a blind intersection, a body flung against steel and glass. They told me later my car flipped twice. I broke 3 ribs, crushed my clavicle, and suffered a traumatic brain injury. That the first responders barely stabilised me. The hospital staff had to induce a coma to manage the swelling. But I remember none of that. Only voices arguing over my bed. "I'm sorry," a nurse had said. "She listed you as emergency contacts. We need consent to proceed." "She's not our daughter," my mother had said. "Not legally," my father added. "We never formalised it. No signature, no paperwork, no obligation. Isn't there a charity fund for indigent cases?" my mother had asked, as if I were some stray dog, not the girl she'd raised for almost 3 decades. The doctors did what they could. Under emergency provision laws, they operated. But they made a note that no one came. That the ones listed as a family chose not to authorise treatment. Chose not to stay. 3 days later, Sloane arrived. She signed the papers. She brought in a lawyer. She argued with hospital administrators. She sat by my bed every day reading emails and articles just in case I could hear. She brought lavender lotion and insisted the nurses rub it on my hands so my skin wouldn't crack. Sloane saved me. Not just with signatures, but with belief. She wasn't the only one. Emily found out through a mutual friend. She wasn't told by our parents. She came to the hospital, but I was still unconscious. My grandmother's lawyer contacted me when I finally opened my eyes. Not because he knew I was awake, but because he had to deliver the contents of her will. Martha Hart, the only person who had ever truly seen me, had passed away in her sleep while I was in that coma. She had left me everything: her house, her journals, and a letter. In that letter, I would learn the truth about my birth, about the lie my parents told even themselves. But that part of the story belongs to later. This part is about dying, and living anyway. You see, I didn't come back with gratitude. I came back with clarity. My parents had chosen convenience over love, image over integrity, and they had failed the final test of family, not in a courtroom, but in an ICU. So I made a vow. They would never define me again. And when they came, not for me, but for my grandmother's estate, I would be ready, waiting, with a letter of my own. Because sometimes you have to die to learn how to live. And this time, I wasn't coming back quietly. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. But what they don't tell you is how easily truth gets edited out of the frame. There's a photo hanging in my parents' living room, a glossy print in a polished walnut frame, Easter brunch, maybe 10 years ago. My mother's in a pastel pink blouse, pearls at her neck, her smile camera ready. My father's got that practiced posture of a man used to holding court in boardrooms and cocktail parties. And in the centre, like always, is Emily. Blonde hair and curls, hands on hips leaning slightly forward like the whole world exists to capture her. Then there's me, Evelyn, off to the side, half-shadowed, blinking at the flash. Forgotten even in the freeze frame. That was my childhood, a supporting role in the Emily show. Emily, with her impromptu tantrums that were called independent spirit. Emily could scream her way out of piano lessons and get praised for being assertive. Emily, who flunked a math quiz and was told, "You're just more artistic." Meanwhile, I aced every assignment, folded laundry without being asked, and vacuumed the living room while Emily threw popcorn at the cat, and still I was the responsible one. No applause, no fuss, just the quiet burden of being good. "Evelyn's always so helpful," my mother would say when guests were over, her voice tight with the kind of praise that's more observation than admiration. "She's very disciplined." That word, disciplined, not delightful, not adored, just efficient. One summer I won first place in the regional spelling bee. Emily came in third in a school art contest. My certificate was folded into a drawer. Her sketch, a crayon rendering of a blue dog with wings, was framed and hung in the hallway. "She needs the encouragement more," my father said when I asked about it. "You're already motivated." Inner monologue. So my hard work is its own reward, but her effort is a miracle. Got it. Birthdays were always the same. I got books. She had a party. Even when we were little, Emily's cakes were elaborate themes planned months in advance, unicorns, princesses, and once even an entire tea party with real bone china. Mine were sheet cakes from the grocery store, picked up on the way home from work. At first, I didn't question it. I thought it was normal. Some kids are just quieter. Some sisters are just brighter. Right. But over time, the accumulation of subtle erasures began to feel like drowning in plain sight. I remember one night, maybe 11 years old, curled up on the window seat in my room. It was raining. I watched the drops trickle down the glass and tried to imagine what it would feel like to be the centre of someone's world. Just once. Not the afterthought. Not the dutiful daughter who made things easy. I wrote in my diary that night, "Maybe if I disappeared, they wouldn't notice until dinner." That sentence stayed with me for years. In middle school, I made the honour roll every semester. Emily got caught cheating on a science project. She cried during the meeting with the principal, and my parents grounded her for a week, but they also took her out for frozen yogurt afterward. She was so ashamed, my mother said. We just wanted to remind her she's still loved. In a monologue. I guess shame earned soft serve. Excellence earned silence. It wasn't all malicious. My parents weren't villains in a movie. They were just human, flawed, blind in ways that made my life feel invisible. The house was always immaculate. Holidays were scripted, matching pajamas, Christmas cards signed love from the Mitchells with perfect teeth and perfect lies. We had dinner at 7 in Durrow, sharp cloth napkins folded into fans. My father read the Wall Street Journal between bites of roast chicken. My mother asked Emily about ballet. No one asked me anything unless it involved grades. Your sister needs the attention more, they'd say. But what I needed, what I craved, was to be seen. Just once, I wanted someone to look past the straight A's and see the girl hiding behind them. I remember a school counsellor once calling home to suggest I join a writing competition. She's very expressive, the counsellor said. A lot going on under the surface. My mother's reply, "Oh, Evelyn doesn't need more on her plate. She's not the creative type," in a monologue. I was full of words. They just never reached her ears. And so, I wrote in secret. Poems scribbled in notebooks. Short stories typed in Word docs I named math homework. All of it was buried under the weight of who I was expected to be. Until one day, I stopped trying to be seen. I just focused on excelling. It was easier to be useful than to be loved. Looking back now, I think that's when the real fracture began, not with the adoption, not with the accident, but in those small moments of absence dressed up as order. Our family was a perfect frame around a broken picture. And I, Evelyn Hart, was the part they cropped out. The night I lost my name didn't arrive with thunder or raised voices, it came with whispers behind a kitchen door. I was 13. Too old to be naive, too young to bear the weight of truth. I'd woken up thirsty, just a glass of water that was all I wanted. But as I descended the stairs in bare feet, the hum of hushed anger stopped me cold. "You always favoured Emily," my mother's voice hissed through the cracked kitchen door. "Don't act like this is about fairness. We both knew what this was," my father shot back. "You said yes to Evelyn because you thought we couldn't have children. Then Emily came and everything changed." I dropped the glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor like a scream swallowed too late. Inside, silence fell. A beat. Then 2. I ran. I don't remember getting back to my room, just the weight of those words echoing louder than the crash. "You said yes to Evelyn." I crawled into bed and turned my face to the wall. When my mother opened the door a few minutes later, her voice was syrup sweet. "Everything all right, darling? Heard something break." I didn't move. In my mind, the phrase looped. "You said yes to Evelyn." The next morning, I waited for them to say something. Anything. I watched them pour coffee, spread jam on toast, and chat about Emily's piano recital. I sat, frozen, in my chair, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Finally, I said it. Quietly, like a question I wasn't sure I had the right to ask. "I heard you last night." My mother's butter knife paused mid-spread. My father folded the newspaper a little slower. "I know I'm adopted." My mother let out a breath short-clipped. Then she smiled. "Don't be ridiculous, Evelyn. You must have had a bad dream." That was all. Gaslighting. As easy as breathing. I sat there staring into my orange juice, wondering if I had dreamed it. If the broken glass hadn't happened. If I was losing my mind. But I wasn't. I knew what I heard. I knew what they refused to say. And that day, something inside me began to rot. You see, before that moment, I still believed I could earn my place. That if I tried hard enough, loved deep enough, achieved big enough, they'd see me. After that, I realized they saw me all along. They just didn't care. I became a ghost child, visible only when convenient, valuable only as decoration. When Emily failed, I was the contrast. When she succeeded, I was the echo. At school, I smiled through perfect grades. At home, I polished silence into an art form. Sometimes I'd stare at the family photo in the hallway. Emily was in the centre, her blonde curls catching light like a halo. My mother's hand rested on her shoulder. My father stood behind her proud. And me, I was off to the side, slightly out of focus, like the lens had lost interest before reaching me. I used to think it was an accident, that the blur was technical. Now I knew better. It was a perfect metaphor. I began writing in secret, journals filled with questions I couldn't ask aloud. Who gave birth to me? Did she love me? Why did they take me if they didn't want me? No answers came, only the ache of wondering. Once I confronted my mother again, just before high school. Was I adopted? I asked, staring straight into her eyes. Her mouth twitched. Why would you say something like that? Because I don't look like you. Because I don't feel like I belong. She laughed a short, brittle sound. Teenagers, she said, turning away. So dramatic. The conversation ended there, like all the others, with a door shut and a truth buried. But I never stopped wondering. Not because I needed pity, not even because I wanted answers, but because deep down I still hoped someone would look me in the eye and say, "You are wanted." No one did. So I learned to want myself. Quietly. Desperately. And yet the silence grew louder. Years later in therapy, I would call that moment the first death. The one no one noticed. The death of certainty. The death of belonging. The birth of a question, who am I in this house? And if I wasn't their daughter, if they never wanted me, then what did that make me a guest, a ghost, or something far more dangerous? A truth they were too afraid to name. The headlines said it all, youngest female CEO in New England tech history. The photographs captured me in sleek blazers, my name printed boldly beneath company logos, shaking hands with investors. From the outside, I was the pinnacle of success. Accomplished, polished, admired. But no camera ever lingered long enough to capture what followed the flash loneliness. They never asked about the silence I returned to every night. No journalist wondered if I had someone to celebrate with when the deals closed. No one ever questioned how a 28-year-old built an empire with no family cheering in the crowd. Because I had become exactly what they wanted, the kind of daughter you showcase, not the kind you hold close. I remember the first major pitch I won. A room of venture capitalists, sharp suits, sharper smiles. They grilled me for an hour until one of them finally leaned back and said, "You're relentless, Ms. Hart. I like that." Later that evening, I called home. My mother answered. "Mum, we secured Series B funding," I said, breathless. 15 million. She paused. "That's nice, dear. Did Emily tell you she's speaking at the Harvard Med Conference?" I stood in the parking lot holding my phone like it was a foreign object. "That's great," I said finally. "Tell her congratulations. You should come by for dinner Sunday. Emily's bringing a new guy she's seeing. No mention of the money. The win. The fact I just changed the trajectory of my company. The only recognition I received was a dinner invite to watch someone else be celebrated. Grandmother Martha used to say, 'Some people give love like sunlight, constant warm. Your parents, they give it like lightning, sudden, rare, and always striking someone else.' I didn't want to believe her, until it happened again. 2 years ago, my company filed a patent application for our flagship AI diagnostic tool. A month later, we were blindsided with a lawsuit patent interference. My legal team was shocked when they saw who represented the opposing company, Mitchell & Rose, my father's firm, the same father who told me family is above all else. When I confronted him, he didn't even blink. "Business is business, Evelyn. We represent whoever pays us best. But it's my technology. You're helping them steal it. You'll survive. You always do." I remember staring at him across his polished mahogany desk. For a moment, I wondered if he saw me at all, or just the performance I gave, the product he helped shape. At that moment, I knew I was never his daughter. I was a resume line, a trophy, an idea, not a person. At industry events, colleagues would ask, "Isn't your father proud? Look at what you've done." I'd smile, say something vague. "He's aware." In private, I'd sit in my corner office late at night, the hum of city lights outside staring at the framed degree from MIT, the same one they refused to hang in the family home. "Too flashy," my mother said when I gave it to her. We don't want Emily to feel overshadowed. That was the pattern. Everything I accomplished was either too much or not enough. The perfect storm of invisibility. Once, after a speaking engagement, a young woman approached me. "Your story is inspiring," she said. "Your parents must be so proud." I wanted to tell her the truth, that the people who raised me used my success as a social currency, but withheld love like it was a limited resource. Instead, I nodded. "Thanks." "They are." Because what else could I say? The final fracture came at a networking gala. I was giving the keynote. As I stepped off stage, applause still echoing, I saw them, my parents, standing near the back. It should have felt like a homecoming. Instead, it felt like surveillance. My mother hugged me with arms stiff as marble. "Impressive," she said. "But don't forget, it was our discipline that made you who you are." My father simply nodded. "Useful connections here tonight? Don't waste them." I realized then that they weren't proud. They were taking inventory. Every step I took upward was just another notch in their self-image, another asset to reference at dinner parties. I wasn't their child. I was their brand, and I was done. That night, I returned to my high-rise, took off my heels, and sat barefoot on cold tile. The city glowed below, unaware that a woman at the top could feel so hollow. In the quiet, I whispered to myself, "I've won everything except the right to be loved." The thought echoed until it became truth. Not because I wasn't worthy, but because they never intended to love me at all. The beeping of hospital machines was no longer foreign to me. It was a language of survival, an erratic metronome that had counted each second I remained tethered to life. When my eyes opened to the soft white hospital ceiling tiles and the muted grey light of dawn filtering through the window, it felt less like waking and more like surfacing from the bottom of a long, dark lake. I didn't ask where I was. I already knew. I didn't ask who had stayed. I already knew the answer. No one had. A nurse noticed my stirring her gasp, soft and full of disbelief. She rushed out to alert the doctors, but in that brief moment of solitude, I understood something crystal clear. I was alive, but not by their choice. "Welcome back, Nurse Emily," whispered later, her eyes warm and steady as she checked my IV. She was the first real presence I felt. She'd been there talking to me while I slept in that half-death. "You've got someone upstairs looking out for you." She didn't know how right she was. Days passed. My strength returned slowly, but surely stitched together by physical therapy, quiet determination, and the anger I hadn't yet found words for. Samantha, my business partner, visited me every day. She kept the company running. She brought updates. She brought kindness. But no parents, no family. Until James Wright walked in. He was old Boston polished shoes, steel grey hair, and a leather briefcase that looked like it had carried more secrets than files. He introduced himself as my grandmother's lawyer. My heart clutched. "Grandmother." "She passed in her sleep," he said softly, placing a hand over mine. "But before she did, she left you something." He pulled out a thick envelope, heavy with what it carried. I waited until nightfall to open it, needing quiet, needing space. The letter inside was in her handwriting, delicate and looping, the kind of script that felt like a whisper from another time. "My dearest Evelyn," If you're reading this, then I've failed to tell you something in person. Forgive me. Some truths grow heavier, with age, not lighter. I read the letter once, then again, and again. The woman I called grandmother was in truth my great-aunt. My biological mother had been her niece Caroline, an 18-year-old girl scared and alone. My adoption had been within the family, done with intention, with hope. Caroline had died years ago, but she had loved me. She had asked about me. And my grandmother, my real grandmother, in every way that mattered, had watched the coldness with which I'd been raised. She had tried to speak up, to intervene. My adoptive parents had always had excuses. She's strong, they'd say. She doesn't need coddling. They had wanted a child and picked me like selecting furniture. But when their biological miracle happened, my sister Emily, I became the extra piece in the room, the one no one knew where to place. Inside the envelope were also documents, my birth certificate, adoption papers, and legal confirmations. Not just whispers, but proof. I was their daughter. They had no right to deny me, no right to leave me to die. And in that moment, I stopped wondering if I was enough, because the question was never about me. The weight I had carried all my life, that I had to perform, to deserve affection, to be exceptional, to be visible, wasn't mine to bear. It belonged to them, their limitations, their insecurities, their failure to love someone who didn't look or shine the way they expected. For the first time, I saw the difference between inheritance and legacy. They had left me in pain, but she, my grandmother, had left me the truth. And truth demanded a response. I turned to the window. Outside, the city still moved in its usual rhythm, but inside everything had shifted. The girl who had whispered apologies into the darkness of her room was gone. I was Evelyn Hart. I had been chosen once by a frightened mother who loved me, and now I would choose myself. I asked James the next morning to help me prepare for what he asked gently. For war, I said, but one fought with the truth, and I intend to win. The room smelled like mahogany and old books. My grandmother's study, now mine, had become a war room. On one side of the desk sat my laptop open to an evidence spreadsheet. On the other, stacks of legal documents, correspondence, surveillance records, and the letter that had changed everything. I looked at the framed photo of Grandma Rose, her eyes forever caught mid-laugh. She had fought for me in silence. Now it was my turn to make noise. I was done trying to earn love. Now I was here for justice. They abandoned me when I needed them most. They showed up only when money was involved. Fine. Let's speak the only language they understand: consequences. I worked with James, my grandmother's long-time attorney, a kind but razor-sharp man who knew every clause, every loophole. We started with the basics, my hospital footage. Emily, the nurse who had been my only voice in that coma, confirmed the timestamps and conversations. My father's cold dismissal, my mother's cruel precision: she's not our daughter, we owe her nothing. We clipped the exact moments. I watched it a dozen times each time, feeling the fire at my chest grow stronger. It wasn't just betrayal, it was disownment broadcast through a hospital hallway. The footage would speak in court louder than I ever could. Next, we traced their movements. The day I was admitted into intensive care, they had already filed to contest the will. Emily had testified that they left without so much as asking about my recovery. They had, in fact, gone straight to a lawyer's office to begin claiming what they thought was rightfully theirs. James helped secure records of the legal filings, time-stamped precisely. I wanted more. I hired a private investigator to confirm they were snooping around Grandma's estate, attempting to remove valuables. We installed discreet security cameras inside the property. I watched the footage like a strategist observing enemy movements. every sigh, every eye roll, every entitled demand. My father. This vase alone could be worth 5 grand. My mother. She won't need it where she's going. They weren't grieving, they were shopping. Then came the courtroom. It wasn't as grand as movies make it seem. Just pale walls, flickering fluorescence, and a tired judge who probably expected just another inheritance dispute. But this was my battleground. My parents' lawyer painted them as confused and traumatized. They didn't understand Evelyn's condition, he insisted. They were grieving prematurely. James stood calmly. Your Honour, he said, we have visual and audio evidence of the defendants refusing life-saving treatment, denying their legal parental role, and subsequently attempting to control her estate within hours. This wasn't grief, it was calculation. We submitted the hospital footage. The room fell silent as their voices played. She's not our daughter. Don't treat her. I looked at them across the courtroom. My mother's hands trembled in her lap. My father stared at his shoes. This is the moment they realised they're not untouchable anymore. When the judge adjourned, he didn't offer much commentary. This court finds no justification for the defendant's actions. The adoption is legally binding. The estate remains with Ms. Evelyn Hart. Conservatorship is denied. It was done. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like standing in the ashes of a house you once tried to build. Back in the study that night, James handed me a glass of scotch and sat across from me. You've done something few people can do, he said. You looked betrayal in the face and didn't flinch. I took a sip. The burn felt good. Real. Will they try again? I asked. They may, he said. But next time they won't have the element of surprise. Outside the window, snow began to fall quiet and clean. Emily had texted earlier, still on for brunch. Sunday, I replied, yes. Samantha sent me a voice memo. You're stronger than anyone I know. I wasn't fighting for their love anymore. I was building a life where love was chosen, not coerced, where protection didn't come with strings, where family meant those who stood beside you, not those who shared your blood. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about truth. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was finally living in it. The cafe was quiet, tucked away in a tree-lined corner of Cambridge, where the old red brick buildings whispered stories through their ivy-draped walls. I chose a window seat, the kind that made you feel both seen and safe. My hands cupped a warm mug, but the heat didn't reach my fingers. Outside, the world moved calmly. Inside, I was waiting for a storm I wasn't sure I could weather. Then Emily walked in. Not the girl I remembered, the one who had been adored without condition, always at the centre of the frame. This woman was tentative. Her shoulders pulled in her eyes, uncertain. She wore no makeup. She wasn't performing. Emily softly, "Hey!" Me nodding. "Hey!" She sat across from me, fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. For a moment, we just breathed the same air, unsure where to begin. "Emily, I've been trying to write to you, but everything felt too small. So was I. But some truths aren't meant to be typed. They need eye contact." She looked up. Her eyes glistened. "I knew they were hard on you," she whispered. "But I didn't realise how deep it went. Not until I saw the footage. Not until I read the documents." I said nothing. I needed her to keep going. I believed them when they said you were just strong, that you didn't need attention, that you preferred being alone. But that wasn't fair. Evelyn. No, it wasn't. But I let it happen too. I didn't speak up. "Emily, you shouldn't have had to." Her voice cracked. She wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. I reached across the table slowly and she didn't pull away. Her fingers curled into mine like a lifeline. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," she said. "I'm here to offer mine. To the sister I should have protected her, the one I didn't see." The cafe around us blurred. The clink of mugs, the hiss of steam, the low hum of conversation, all of it faded. This is what healing sounds like. Not an apology, a reckoning. I don't want to be them, she added. I don't want to live pretending everything's perfect while hurting the people I love. I squeezed her hand. You're not them, Em. You showed up. We sat there for over an hour. No grand confessions, just memories traded like tokens. She remembered the time I fixed her science project. I remembered the night she snuck into my room when our parents were fighting. Somewhere in between coffee refills and shared laughter, the wall between us cracked. She handed me a small envelope before we parted. Inside was a photo. We were children, maybe 5 and 7, covered in mud after a backyard rainstorm. Emily had her arm slung around my shoulder, both of us laughing wild and free. I found it last week, she said. I wanted you to have it. It's the only one I've seen where you're in the centre. I looked up at her. Thank you. She smiled the same crooked grin from our childhood. I hope we can start again. Not from the beginning. From now. I nodded. From now is enough. As she left, I watched her disappear into the crowd. A weight lifted not the burden of betrayal, but the burden of solitude. I had spent my life trying to define family by who failed me. Now I could redefine it by who stayed. The days that followed were filled with small, deliberate gestures. Emily began texting me every morning, sometimes just a meme, sometimes a quote from a book we both loved as kids. We met once a week at that same cafe. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we just sat in silence. But we were there. One afternoon, she brought me a scarf. You used to borrow this all the time, she said. Figured it's yours now. It was frayed at the edges, worn, but familiar. Another time I brought her an old notebook of mine, half poetry, half letters never sent. She cried when she read it. I didn't know you were in pain, she whispered. You always looked so put together. I was surviving, I said. Survival doesn't always look broken. She told me she was thinking about therapy, about setting boundaries with our parents, about learning how to be a sister. I told her that was enough, that trying was enough. On a Sunday morning, we sat on a park bench watching families play by the pond. Emily said, Do you ever think about what it would have been like if things had been different? I thought for a moment. Sometimes, I said, but then I think, if everything had gone the way I wanted, maybe we wouldn't be here. Maybe we wouldn't be real. She nodded. Then she said something I'll never forget. Family isn't who you're born to. It's who doesn't leave. I didn't cry, not then. But later, when I was alone, I held that moment like a candle. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel cold. The house smelled like old roses and lemon oil, the kind of scent that belonged to memory more than matter. I stood in the doorway of my grandmother's home, my home now keys still warm in my palm. Sunlight poured through the windows, catching the dust in golden spirals. The walls didn't echo like the ones I grew up in. These walls remembered kindness. It was the first time in years I felt like I'd arrived somewhere I was allowed to stay. The move had been quiet. No press, no announcements, just a van, a few boxes, and Samantha hauling my bookshelf in with a grin. Emily brought over a plant and 2 folding chairs. It's temporary, she said, until you find the perfect couch. But we never replaced those chairs. They stayed. In the weeks that followed, the house became more than shelter. It became a gathering. Laughter, rest, it became mine. I painted the living room a warm cream and filled the shelves with books I loved and records I'd forgotten. I found my grandmother's recipe box and cooked my way through it, making dishes that tasted like memory and healing. We had dinners every Sunday. Not formal. Just whoever felt like coming. Emily, Samantha, Nurse Emily from the hospital. James and his granddaughter who played the cello like it was prayer. We'd sit on the patio under string lights, barefoot, passing dishes and stories. One evening, I looked around that table. Emily was leaning against the banister, wine glass in hand, laughing at something Samantha said. James was explaining legal philosophy to a teenager. Someone had brought pie. Someone was playing piano inside, and I realised this was family, not the kind I was born into, the kind I built. Love isn't bound by blood. It's shown by presence. They stayed, through the storm, through the truth, through the reconstruction, and Evelyn Hart was whole again. It wasn't always easy. There were days when the silence stretched long, when I'd open a drawer and find an old photo or a relic of the person I used to be. There were days when anger still whispered when the urge to scream into a pillow returned. Trauma is not a chapter that closes neatly. It leaves fingerprints, but I learned to breathe through it, to keep going, to not shrink back when joy appeared. I was relearning how to trust the light. Emily and I grew closer. She came by often, not just to visit, but to belong. We planted herbs on the windowsill, burned old journals in the fire pit one night and cried without apology. She started seeing a therapist, started setting boundaries, started becoming the kind of sister I never dared to hope for. Not perfect, but present. "I don't want to be a ghost in your story anymore," she told me one night. "You never were," I said, "just lost in the wrong chapter." One afternoon, I hosted a dinner, not to celebrate a win, but to simply exist. I invited people who had shown up not because of obligation, but because of love. The backyard shimmered with soft lights, the long table filled with mismatched chairs and mismatched people. Samantha brought a bottle of wine and a loaf of sourdough she baked herself. James brought stories, the kind that made us laugh until we wheezed. Nurse Emily arrived with 2 kinds of pasta salad and a playlist that made everyone dance. We toasted not to endings, but to beginnings. To Evelyn James, said raising his glass, for building a home out of ashes. I smiled my heart full in ways I hadn't thought possible. Sometimes we don't get the family we need, so we create it, brick by brick, hug by hug, laugh by laugh. After dessert, as twilight kissed the sky, Emily took my hand. "You ever miss them?" she asked. I paused. "Sometimes, but not in the way I thought I would. I miss the idea of them, the version I created in my head. But I don't miss the reality." She nodded. "That makes sense." We sat in silence, the kind that feels like music. A week later, a letter arrived. From my parents. Apology, possibly. Justification, likely. I didn't open it. I placed it on the mantel beneath a framed quote that now guided my days. Family is not defined by blood. It is forged by those who stay when others walk away. I had walked through fire, and now I was dancing in the rain. My name was no longer a question. I was Evelyn Hart. And that was enough to begin again. I found out from a neighbour. They sold the house Mrs. Porter told me over the phone, her voice a mix of curiosity and concern, packed up in silence. No goodbye, just gone. I thanked her and hung up. I didn't need to ask which house she meant. I already knew. My parents had left Boston. No press, no statements, just a van like shadows slipping out before sunrise. After the court ruling, after Emily's affidavit and my unshakable proof, they didn't show up in public again. The silence they used to weaponize had returned this time as a shield for themselves. They always chose disappearance over discomfort. This was no different. But now their absence wasn't an abandonment, it was a release. I checked my phone out of habit. Their numbers were still blocked. The last message from my mother was still there unopened. "You've embarrassed us. Hope it was worth it." It was, because I could finally breathe. Not the shallow breath of trying to fit into a mould, but the full exhale of stepping into your own skin. I walked past their old house a week later, just once. The for sale sign was gone, replaced with a quiet lawn and drawn curtains. It didn't sting like I thought it would. It didn't feel like a loss. It felt like closure. In my pocket, my fingers traced the outline of a stone I'd picked up from my grandmother's garden. Smooth, cool, permanent, unlike people who run it stayed. That evening I returned home to my own porch, lit by golden hour, warm and inviting. Emily was already there, feet up on the railing sipping lemonade. "They're really gone?" she asked. I nodded. She didn't celebrate, neither did I. Some endings don't need fanfare. Some peace arrives not with applause, but with silence. The next morning I opened the windows, let the wind move through the house, through the curtains, through the quiet. I stood in the kitchen, barefoot brewing coffee, letting the warmth settle into my hands. Outside, birds called softly. No footsteps, no orders, no clipped comments from a mother trying to prune me into perfection. Just light and lightness. For years, I begged for a kind of peace I thought only they could give by changing, by loving, by seeing me. But peace was never theirs to grant. It was mine to claim. Emily came by later with flowers. Not for any reason, she said. Just because it's Thursday. We arranged them together in a tall glass vase, their colours loud and alive. "This house feels like you," she said, looking around. "Not just what you've made of it, what you've allowed into it." I smiled. It took losing everything I thought I needed to find what I actually did. We cooked dinner together that evening. Not fancy, just pasta, garlic bread and a salad made of leftovers. We danced in the kitchen to old Motown records, laughing when Emily spilled olive oil across the tile. Later, we curled up on the couch with tea, sharing stories we had never dared to tell before. Childhood moments where silence screamed, where we reached out and found no hands waiting. Now, we reached and found each other. "Do you think they'll ever try to come back?" Emily asked softly. "I don't know," I said, "but I know that I won't wait for them." She nodded. Me neither. Samantha dropped by over the weekend with a fresh batch of cinnamon rolls. "You look different," she said, eyeing me as I poured coffee. "Lighter." "I feel lighter," I replied, like I finally stepped out of someone else's mirror. We sat on the back steps sharing bites and watching the wind move through the trees. "I thought winning would feel like a triumph," I said. "But it doesn't." "What does it feel like?" "Like silence, but the kind that heals, not the kind that wounds." Samantha smiled. "That's better than victory." I took up gardening. I knew nothing about it, but Grandma's notes helped. I planted roses, thyme, lavender, touched the soil like it held answers. In a way it did. Growth wasn't loud. It was patient, buried, stubborn, and miraculous. Every bloom felt like a prayer answered. Every weed pulled felt like a lie undone. At night, I wrote in my journal. Not to process pain, but to document joy. A new ritual, a new rhythm. Sometimes I wrote letters to my past self. You are not hard to love. You were just waiting in the wrong places. You are not a mistake. You were planted in the wrong soil. But look at you now. I lit a candle each time I finished an entry. Let it flicker until it burns out naturally. No force, no rush, just presence. They left, and I stayed. And in the stillness, I began again. The launch was quiet and intentional. Not a grand press release or glitzy unveiling. Just a room filled with people who mattered. People who stayed when I couldn't speak, when I couldn't walk, when I wasn't sure I was still someone worth fighting for. We called the software Whisper. Designed for patients recovering from brain trauma, it translated eye movement and facial micro-expressions into simple communicative cues. Yes, no pain. I'm here. A bridge between silence and voice. Inspired by the days when I was locked in my own mind, unable to scream that I was still alive. Sometimes the best things we build rise from the wreckage, not despite it, but because of it. I stood at the front of the room, Samantha to my left, James to my right, and Emily in the front row. Her eyes shimmered with pride, and when our glances met, we didn't need to speak. The demo was seamless. A young girl named Lila, recently out of a coma, used her gaze to say, "Thank you." The room went still. Then it burst into applause. Afterward, we gathered at my home. The long table on the patio was full, bowls of food passed hand to hand, wine glasses clinking, candles flickering in mason jars. Emily made her signature spinach lasagna. Samantha brought a playlist that had us dancing between courses. James laughed like he'd just remembered how. This wasn't a celebration of tech. It was a celebration of witness. Every person at that table had seen me, not just in my strength, but in my lowest, quietest moments. And they had stayed. Emily moved in the following week. Just for a few months, she said, dropping her duffel on the floor. "Stay as long as you need," I told her. Stay as long as you want. Living together wasn't perfect. She left dishes in the sink. I monopolized the bathroom. But every morning she made us coffee. Every night we watched the stars. One evening she found a dusty telescope in the attic. "We used to fight over this," she said, adjusting the lens. "You always wanted to look at Saturn. I wanted the moon." We laughed. Then we took turns. And when I looked through the telescope at that tiny ringed planet, I whispered, "Still beautiful. Healing isn't a final chapter. It's a daily choice, a quiet rewriting, a decision to keep showing up." In the weeks that followed, Whisper began rolling out in regional hospitals. I received letters from patients' caregivers and nurses who saw in it the power of being heard. One message from a father read, "You gave me back my daughter's eyes." I cried when I read that. Not because I was proud, but because I understood. I had once begged in silence to be seen, and now I was giving that gift to others. We were invited to a medical technology panel 2 months later. Emily stood beside me in a sleek black suit. When I spoke on stage about my journey, I saw tears in the eyes of strangers. Not pity, recognition. After the panel, a young woman approached me. "My brother is nonverbal. He's 15. I never knew what he was feeling. Until now." She handed me a small note her brother had typed with, "Whisper, I love you, I hear you." I held that note like it was glass. On the last night of summer, we hosted a small dinner, just 10 of us. Familiar faces, familiar laughs. The sky turned lavender, then indigo. The table buzzed with warmth. Emily sat beside me, her hand brushing mine. Samantha leaned back in her chair, humming to herself. James told a story about Grandma Rose, how she once told a judge he was too stiff to taste good wine. The stars came out slowly as if they were listening too. Later, Emily and I sat on the balcony. The wind was soft. The night was honest. She broke the silence. "They're not in our lives anymore." I nodded. "But we're still here." I turned to her. "Yes," I said. "And we're not alone. Not anymore." And that's how the story ends. Not with revenge, but with resilience. Not with applause, but with peace. Not with family by blood, but with family by choice. We began again with the truth. And it was enough.